Almighty and ever-living God, we just thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to come together in your name as believers to strengthen one another in our mutual faith. And we just ask, Lord, on the eve of Thanksgiving, that you would just continue to build within our hearts that gratitude that you have placed there. And we ask you to increase the faith, hope, and charity, and just continue to protect and guide your church. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus the Lord.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So I want to finish up chapter 3 really quick, and then we'll do questions. And I passed out chapter 4 last time. I think there's some extras on the back, if not. But I want to get through 3, so we're done with it. On page 9 of the handout, we're looking at chapter 3, the second half, which is called True Wisdom, which starts with verse 13. And after having sort of described the false wisdom or the wisdom of the world, James then goes on to describe what the true wisdom is. And this is verse 17 of chapter 3. He says, "But the wisdom from above is first of all pure, then peaceable, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, without inconstancy or insincerity. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace for those who cultivate peace." So in in Greek, this would come out as 7 different phrases. In English, it comes out about 8. But James is setting forth a typical thing you see of Hebrew authors in the Old and New Testament, and that is using sacred numbers to kind of give additional understanding to some of the things. So he says peace, and notice how he says first of all. That means the guiding principle, the big one is peace. So this is the lens, the important one through which all the others are seen. And then what he's done is he's sort of apportioned them into 3 different groups. As I put here on chapter 9 here at the bottom, you have 3 bullet points. Some are dispositions that we're supposed to possess. Some are actions we're supposed to perform. And some are kind of the stability we're supposed to experience. And so the way that he sort of divides these up is when it talks about wise dispositions, he has those first ones. Peaceable, gentle or gentleness, and compliant. And sorry, before I go further, I totally messed up. Oh, yeah.
We're so happy.
A lot, you guys just don't know. No, I'm just kidding. You believe all kinds of weird stuff. No, I'm just teasing. Number 2, the actions, he says, full of mercy and good fruits, which is really the same thing. Because for James, mercy entails doing good works. So the good fruits are sort of the result of mercy. And then without inconstancy or insincerity. So he kind of has these 3 groups of which he explains what wisdom is. But the primary one is this idea of purity. Now, purity is big for Judaism, right from the beginning of the Torah on. And purity does not mean sort of just a passive state of not being defiled or sinful, but it's actually an active state of remaining unstained by the world. Remember, James referred to that way back in chapter 1, the very last verse. He says, true religion is to care for widows and orphans and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So purity for Judaism and for James is this active process that you don't just kind of sit back and hope you're in a state of purity, but it's something you're continually sort of actively pursuing. So the pure person is the person who's united with God, who's with the source of all purity. And the Hebrew term for holiness or purity really means, the term actually means separate or set apart. That's what the term holy means, set apart. Because God is the ultimate purity, right? He's absolutely different than anything else that exists. He's set apart from anything. And then with human beings, God sort of, in a sense, sets them apart from the greater human race in order to sort of bring them into experience of his own life. And hopefully, in the plan is that purity will spread sort of from the first group outwards. Always remember James has that title he calls us, the first fruits. That we're supposed to be sort of the leaven and everything that begins the transformation of the greater world beyond us, human and otherwise, the restoration of the earth. So purity is kind of the lens through which everything else comes from. It's that relationship, being grounded, being connected with the Lord. So a pure person is one who's wholly and completely aligned with God. So they're not a person of two minds like James keeps referring to. They're focused on the Lord. They seek to imitate him. So there's that personal devotion of striving to live like Yahweh. And James is still very early in the tradition. So James does not use actually Jesus as the model. He uses God the Father, we'd say. He doesn't use as sort of the model of how we're supposed to follow, with Jesus sort of being the prime example of what a human looks like, a human being who's following that model. So James comes at it a slightly different way, but the idea that we're supposed to imitate God or imitate Christ, and then living obediently to the commandments, the Torah of the Messiah, by loving him and others. And so the pure person is deliberately chosen to reject sin and chooses God. And so for that reason, they're the ones who will experience God. And so hence the Beatitude. Blessed are the clean of heart or the pure of heart, they will see God. That term clean of heart or pure of heart, in Greek it literally says the man who is single-hearted. And it goes back to that idea that you're grounded only in the Lord. You don't have multiple allegiances. You don't have God in the world or God in other things, but everything's grounded in God. So even the term in the Beatitudes that we translate as pure or clean is actually single-hearted. You have one heart, one loyalty, one sort of experience. As I mentioned, James kind of divides then the different things into little subgroups. So the first ones have to do with the selfish ambition, overcoming that. So you have peaceable, gentle, compliant. Basically what the view is that James is giving us is such a person is conciliatory, they're open to others, they're ready to yield to the preferences of others when it comes to things that are not moral or theological things, but in things of opinion or matters of taste or whatever. The peaceable and gentle person doesn't have to have their own way, and that results in this gentleness and peace and goodwill. So it's just this person who's gentle, who's kind, who's willing to allow others kind of to take the first place, doesn't have the need to put themselves first in their opinions and everything else, but they maintain sort of that gentle disposition. And this is important to realize, because the whole thing that James is leading to in chapter 3, how it ends is all this is righteousness is sown in peace for those who cultivate peace. And so peace is going to be like that key component that James is aiming for. And in a minute we'll talk about why it's so important at this time and in this particular community that James is talking to. Now the second one has to do with wise actions. Remember, for James, wisdom is always something concrete, how I live it out in the world, my faith. And so the wisdom leads to concrete performance of actions. So full of mercy and good fruits. Mercy is the readiness to show compassion and or forgive and do good works. And the good works are the concrete demonstration of compassion. So a merciful person is one who does deeds of mercy towards those who are in need, but they're also a person who asks forgiveness of others when they've fallen, and they forgive others when others ask it of them. So mercy goes into this whole sort of understanding. A simple way to define mercy, John Paul II gave us in one of his encyclicals, is the Pope said mercy can simply be defined as love in action. That mercy is when love becomes a concrete thing. It's not simply an emotion or a feeling, but it actually takes root in an active service towards the other person, whether it's through forgiveness or whether it's through doing a good deed or whatever it happens to be. So you have your dispositions. You want to come from sort of a gentle, grounded place, like Jesus, meek and humble of heart. Like Jesus again, you want to be living out the life of your faith concretely. And then number 3, and this ties in with purity as well in its own way, is you're a person of honesty and integrity. So without inconstancy or insincerity. So you're grounded. The term humble literally means comes from the word hummus, no, not the stuff you dip pita chips in. Sounds the same. But that word means the ground. Right? It comes from the story of Adam and his creation. What's he made out of? The dust of the ground. So a humble person is by definition one who lives in reality. They know who God is, and they know who they are, that is a creature, in relationship to God. So a humble person acknowledges their strengths and knows their weaknesses as well. They acknowledge both. They live in reality. And so because of that, they're grounded. Right? Because they live in reality, because they're focused on God, they're grounded, they're humble. They don't think they're more than they are, but they don't think they're less than they are either. They realize who they are. A sinner, but one who's a beloved son or daughter of the Lord. And so the humble person is constant and sincere. They know who they are. They're trustworthy. They're consistent. They're stable. They're not double-minded. They don't lack perseverance or trust. They're focused and really grounded in the Lord. And all of this, James tells us, leads to something. He says, and the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace for those who cultivate peace. Now, again, we turn to a beatitude because James is drawing a lot from the story of the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. So peace is kind of the defining characteristic of the people, of what defines us as a Christian, or even an Old Testament Israelite. Is the people of God are those who are people of peace. The Jewish shalom. Peace, though, is not simply the absence of conflict. That's the best the world can do. That's the peace the world can give you. That's why Jesus, when he says, I have come to give you peace, not as the world gives peace, do I give it. Right? Because, one, God doesn't promise there won't be conflict until the time of his coming. And two, the peace he gives is a much more stable and deeper one. Shalom, as I point out here on page 10, the first full paragraph, shalom is a much broader concept. It means to be whole, to be healthy, to be complete. You could translate it fulfillment. And when it's granted by Yahweh himself, it results in this perfect well-being and fullness. You just feel satisfied, you're happy, you're content, you're joyful. So it's a much broader understanding than simply not being in conflict with others. St. Francis drew a lot from the early tradition of Israel. Right? The Franciscan peace be with you, and peace and all good, pax et bonum, really comes from the Shalom Aleichem of Judaism, which is peace be upon you. And so the greeting is pulled from that. Also, when Franciscans speak about peace, they kind of mean it like Jews. For the Franciscan, peace is basically a code word for the fullness of everything that God has to offer. And so that's why the Franciscan is constantly seeking peace. That's why the peace prayer starts, make me an instrument of your peace. And so peace is this real fullness. It's sort of as good as you can get it in this world of enjoyment of God and the kingdom before the fullness of experiencing that. So now, that doesn't mean, however, that the person at peace in this sense is not necessarily at peace in the sense of the world. That is, you might still be undergoing a lot of suffering or conflict or whatever, but it doesn't, because you're grounded in God, it doesn't shake that inner peace. You don't get caught up in those things. You can sort of move past them as all these conflicts and issues are coming. So it's not the promise that you won't have conflict. In fact, Jesus says just the opposite. In the world, you will have tribulation, he tells them before he ascends. You will have tribulation, right? Because the world reacts to it, the fallen world reacts to the church and to Israel like a disease. Because it's like a cancer in the good sense. It's wiping out the evil world. And so the world will not, accept what it is. And so there's going to be conflicts and problems. I mean, James's people are feeling that, but he's promising them the deeper peace that is experienced of that. He points out, though, that the definition of religion that he had told us before, remember, is that righteousness. Because he tells us here, the fruit of righteousness is peace. So how do you achieve peace? Through the living out of those deeds of mercy. Because if you're really to the point in your spiritual life where your interior life is being manifested exteriorly to other people now, not just doing works to do works. We're not social workers, right? But works that actually are flowing from love. Love for God primarily, and perhaps predominantly if we have to. And then hopefully love for people, but sometimes you don't love people, so at least the best you can do is love them because God does. That's a point along the journey for some of us. But you're still exterior. You're living, you're manifesting Christ in the world. So that's why it says those who live in righteousness, or justice would be another same word in Greek, justice and righteousness. It's they who receive peace because they also cultivate peace. So in a sense, by being righteous and striving to be a peaceful person, that divine peace will in fact sort of come upon you as a child of God. When we do this, when we're serving others, the reason it's so important and what people need to recognize is in doing so, we are imitating God himself. Right? James is really simple but very strict definition of religion: to help the helpless, widows and orphans. So when those who are in need, assist them, and to keep yourself pure, away from the ways of the world. That's literally the definition of God, right? The all-compassionate one, who has mercy on those who call out to him and need mercy, and yet at the same time, though he's in the world, God is not of the world at all. He stands apart from it, though present everywhere. And so that's what he calls his people to be. So what we see in James, it's the same thing all the different authors tell us, but James just is coming at it from a different angle than most of us come at it from. Most of us think of it in terms of imitation of Christ, because that's like Paul's image. James is saying the same thing, but instead of Christ, he's simply taking it step to the Father himself. How does the Father act? Which, as the church goes on in its experience, it's the same thing, right? Remember, at James' time, there's no such thing as the Trinity means three persons in one nature, all equal. There's none of that. They're still struggling to define the reality. No one denies the divinity of Christ. James uses terms that can only be used of God for Jesus, right? He's glorious, he's the Lord, he's Christ, he's all these terms. But James doesn't try to set out to ever define philosophically what that means. He simply is content with saying, this is the Messiah who's also divine. So, but the point being, the whole Christian life is one of the imitation of God. Whether we think of it as the imitation of God the Father or the imitation of Christ, or you can think of it as filled with the Holy Spirit, right? It's all the same reality, just using different members of the Trinity to kind of explain it to us. But remember, the whole point of our Christian life is not just to go to Mass, it's not just to do good deeds, it is to become divine-like. It is to become like God. If you just take a moment, and the very next two books are St. Peter's book, letters. If you go to 2 Peter, so it's just several pages beyond James, and you go to the very first chapter of 2 Peter, James here kind of gives us Peter gives us a good example of what James is touching on, but doesn't come all out in one place and say, or says it from a different angle. So, chapter 1 of 2 Peter, so 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. His divine power has bestowed on us everything that makes for life and devotion, bios and eusebia. So, God has given us everything we need for our physical life and happiness, as well as our spiritual life and happiness. That's what it would mean in Greek. Through the knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and power. Remember, knowledge, for just like we're talking about wisdom, knowledge in Hebrew is not intellectual primarily, it's experiential. So as I come to know, in modern terms we say, as I know Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior, or some similar type of idea. I have a personal relationship with the Lord. As I come to that knowledge, through these he has bestowed on us the precious and very great promises. Right? The primary one being the kingdom and eternal life. That's the big promise that we live in hope of. Hope not in the sense of optimism or possibility, but hope knowing it's going to happen. We just don't see it in its fullness yet. He says, through the very great promises, so that through them, you, plural in Greek, so you all of us, may come to share in the divine nature, after escaping from the corruption that is in the world because of evil desire. It's still very Jewish like James. The corruption in the world, the evil desires, etc. But that almost sounds heretical, right? In a sense. You will come to share in the divine nature. Now, he doesn't mean we become the omnipotent, omniscient God. And he doesn't mean we become like in Eastern religions where we just become reunited with whatever the reality is, sort of lose our identity and become part of the whatever you want to call ultimate reality in those religions. He simply means that we share in these characteristics of God's life, right? We will live forever, not because we're God, but because of God's love, so we share a different type. We do experience not omniscience, but a far greater understanding than we do here. Think of the saints, right? How can Mary answer hundreds of thousands, if not millions of prayers daily, right? How can she even hear them all? We can't do that with all the greatest technology we have. Even so, we can't do that. How can she do it? Because she participates in the very life of God in a way we can't even grasp yet. She doesn't become God any more than any of the other saints do, but everything is heightened almost to a supernatural level. So we share in the divine nature. But notice we have to escape the corruption of the world. James said the same thing. Be unstained by the world. And notice how Peter then gives us his own stepladder, if you will, of virtues, of how you go from virtue to virtue all the way to fulfillment. Now it's important to realize every author has a different process. Paul has one in Romans he lays out, and the only things that he and Peter agree on are the beginning point, which is always faith, and the ending point, which is always charity. What that tells us is, if the Bible itself shows multiple ways from faith to charity within the umbrella of Christianity, we need to recognize that each of our own individual spiritualities and walks are not going to follow the same path. Peter didn't seem to experience the same level of constant persecution that Paul did, for example. He did have horrible things. He's arrested early on at the death of the other James, the brother of John. Peter was assigned for death, but he's freed miraculously. And of course, later he would be arrested under Nero and lose his life. But for a large portion of his life, he didn't have the constant sort of threat of death and everything the way Paul did. And so part of it is just reflects their experience. Paul starts with like persecution and difficulties. Peter doesn't start that way because he went through a different way. So notice how he says it here. He says, verse 5, "For this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith." So faith starts with always. Paul does that too. "With virtue." Virtus. It literally means manliness, because vir is the word for male in Latin. So virtue means being manly. Sorry, ladies, it's just a weird thing. And then being virtuous for a woman means not letting someone be manly with you. Right? I mean, I didn't make the word up. I just like, so,
Sure.
But anyways, but what it means is, virtue to us means works, right? So notice, he starts right from your faith has to move into active works. So Peter's following the same line very much as James does. Faith with virtue. Virtue with, notice, knowledge comes third. In the doing and living out of the life, you start to understand. Sure, you had some understanding to begin. You had to. But in the living out of your faith, in going to Mass, in your prayer life, in seeking to live out the gospel with others, knowledge starts to arise. You become proficient. You become sort of second nature in living out this way. That brings you to self-control. Knowledge with self-control. Because of that, you're able to now curb your desires more because you really understand the Lord, His love for you, and these things that were maybe intellectual at first but are becoming more heartfelt. You realize personally the Lord's love for you, and so some of these other things no longer have their same hold. Self-control with endurance. So not only do you learn to control your desires and such that James and Peter talk about, but now you're able to endure. And that's a big one in James, right? To constantly endure, to persevere, to continue in your faith when it's difficult. Endurance with devotion, eusebia. It's interesting, and a lot of scholars, biblical scholars, argue, because we have no way of knowing, of why he places eusebia so far down the chain. Because eusebia, devotion, literally means the ability to worship correctly. So it's this James is saying, even when you go to Mass and you're there, you're not really participating fully until you've sort of lived out this life a little longer. Then you start to get the Mass. Then you start to understand the purpose of the Rosary. Not that it's always benefiting you, but it starts to actually, you get it. But he places it very far down in sort of his personal list. Devotion then leads to mutual affection. So you at least begin to feel kindness towards others. It's actually the word philia, which is a type of love. But it's not God's love. But if you practice that enough under the inspiration of grace, it will eventually become, it's just, they really should have translated it charity, but they just put love at the end. So there's this movement. Now, this may reflect something in Peter's, again, own experience. Notice you end, of course, like we always do with caritas, love, the greatest thing, charity. Go back, if you will, in this difference between philia, which is brotherly love or affection, and agape, which is God's love, willing to, do anything for the other. And go to chapter 21 of John's Gospel really briefly to see where maybe Peter is pulling this, where you have mutual love and then ultimately agape.
Where in John?
John chapter 21, verse 20. Or excuse me, verse 15. You'll know the story. Let's take a little bit of a backtrack for a moment. about a week or so by the time this story comes down. So about a week prior, just a little over a week, Peter was there celebrating the Passover with Jesus. And Peter said, even if you die, I'll die too. And he tells Jesus, I love you more than all these. Even if they don't, I will never fall away. Okay. So he falls away. And then it's over. So Jesus has appeared a few times now, and finally at one of these appearances, the apostles are there, and he has kind of a time alone with Peter. And he says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter. Notice what's interesting is he doesn't call him Peter.
Yeah.
To show him, you've kind of lost something since I named you Rock. Right? You need to regain it. So he says, Simon, son of John, do you love agape? Do you love me? And he says, more than these, because that's the exact words Peter says. I love you more than them. Even if they fall away, I won't. So he pinpoints it. He says, do you agape? Do you love me with your whole heart, mind, soul, right? The love of God. Do you love me? Peter says, he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I philia, love you. I have affection. He says, feed my lambs. Then he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you agape? Do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I, quote, philia, love you. I have affection. So, agape, philia. Agape, philia. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you philia love me? Can you at least pull that one off? Simon. Simon says, Lord, you know everything. You know I love you. Notice Jesus is calling him to here. He can't get there yet. He can't get there. But the threefold thing has to accord. Notice penance is perfect. Sometimes we don't like that. God's justice is absolute and perfect. He denied 3 times. He has to reclaim it 3 times. Right? We don't like that every jot, every tittle that God's looking at. And that's not the main way to look at God. But remember, nothing escapes him. Nothing escapes us. We don't get away with anything. But he calls Peter, and he finally comes down where Peter is. This is fine. If you can only love me like a friend at this point, if you have affection, good enough. But he tells him what will happen. That Peter will achieve this agape love at some point if he stays true. Because he says, Amen, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to dress yourself and go where you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you out where you do not want to go. He said this, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had said this, he said to him, follow me. Follow me to the cross, but also just follow me again, because you fell away. So Peter, having had this experience, when he writes in 1 Peter, and he goes from mutual love, philia, to agape, for him it's a personal experience. He knows he couldn't pull it off. But he couldn't pull it off. This is the resurrected Christ. Even then, I mean, at least God bless Peter for being honest finally. Right? He was a liar at the Last Supper, and he realizes that. Here he has the resurrected Lord, and he still says, I don't know if I could do it. Right? I love you a lot. Like as close as my friends. But I can't do more right now. And so it's a gift. But we have this experience of what Peter's talking about. So now back to James finally. So James, this same kind of idea of caring for orphans and widows, being like Christ, and that's what Peter's telling us. You need to realize why peace is always important in Israel's understanding. But there was, at the time of Jesus and James, the Hebrew world was in great sort of turmoil. Paul refers to himself by this acronym or this attribute, I should say, multiple times. And when we think of the term in modern religious language, a person who's zealous in our understanding, Catholic understanding of the 20th century, is a person who's very devoted, very devout, very active in their love of God. Now that was true of the meaning in Paul's time, but it also had a very specific understanding. You didn't call everyone who was devout zealotus. At the time of Jesus and James, remember that for hundreds of years, Israel has been without its own leadership. And so when the Babylonians take the temple, destroy the temple, take the capital, exile the people in the year 586, 587 BC, then 70 years later, the Persians conquer Babylon, and the Persian emperor allows any Jew who wishes to return to the Holy Land to do so. And so the Jews return to the Holy Land. They begin the building of the temple very modestly, but they're still not in control of their own destiny. They're still a subject state of an empire. Well, Persia ends up losing to Alexander the Great. And at his death, not too long afterwards, within a week after reaching India or something, Alexander dies, and his 3 generals subdivide his empire into 3 parts. And 2 of them have a part to play in Western history. The first one is the general Ptolemy, who rules over from Egypt and has most of the Holy Land, as modern-day Palestine, is under his authority as well as parts of northern Africa and things like this. A little step back about Alexander. Some of you know, or probably many of you know, Alexander's tutor was Aristotle. And we tend to think of Aristotle in glowing terms, you know, the great philosopher, the person who gave so much to the West. That's true. But we also need to recognize that Aristotle was probably one of the most racist people that ever existed that we can point to. It's Aristotle who begins the calling of non-Greek. The word barbari, where we get the term barbarian, the word means non-Greek speaker. It's a term that Aristotle gives to every other culture. And everyone had to become Hellas, Greek, Hellenized. And so he passed on that understanding to Alexander, because for the first time in history we see something very different. Babylon and Persia, they conquer these places, but they pretty much allow everything to remain intact. They might put their own guards in, they might put, you know, some of their own gods in, but basically they leave the culture intact. You belong to us now, you pay taxes, don't revolt, etc. Well, Alexander had a whole different model. Everywhere Alexander conquered, he forcibly tried to enforce Greek culture upon those places. Hellenization. That's why Greek is the language of the world at that time, of the world that they knew. Now, the first Greek general to come in control of Palestine is King Ptolemy, and his descendants will be called the Ptolemies. Cleopatra will be the last one. Cleopatra was not a single drop of actual Egyptian blood. She was 100% Greek. They were intermarried. He married her sibling under the Ptolemies. So anyway, Ptolemy, let's put it this way, Ptolemy didn't believe the hype of Alexander. He was more of an opportunist. He was a great general. He saw where things were going. He rose to become one of the 3 leading generals in Alexander's armies. And at the end of it all, he ended up being an emperor himself. So from his point of view, he could care less what the Jews did with their weird one God and everything else. So long as you pay taxes and you don't cause problems, I'm good. And so Israel has a period of time where it's this very set, kind of calm period. They're under authority, but there's not a lot of conflict at this time. It becomes very simplified. Well, the Ptolemies and another group of Greeks, another general who rules from Syria, his name was Seleucus, and his descendants will become the Seleucids. He totally bought Alexander's hype, 100%. He and Ptolemy battle, and Ptolemy loses, and in that loss, Ptolemy has to cede to him parts of his empire, and part of it empire that part of his empire that he gives to Seleucus is the Holy Land, Palestine. Immediately, Seleucus decides that Judaism has to go. So he outlaws circumcision on penalty of death. He outlaws the kosher laws. He has a statue of himself placed in the temple. And it's horrible. If you want, the story is the book of Maccabees. The two Maccabees. That's the story, and they're horrible stories. And out of this experience of the Ptolemy or of the Seleucids, there come two sort of traditions in Judaism which had not really existed before, except a little bit. One is the martyr. That's the first time you have these huge stories of martyrs. The mother and her 7 sons who were killed, the old man Ananias. You have all these descriptions of their death. And for the first time, martyrdom becomes like a huge part of Jewish self-understanding. And then the other part of that is this armed conflict, kind of going back to Joshua, that God will defend his people to defeat a greater foe. Well, what occurred, like I said, the stories are horrible. Like, Judaism has to completely sort of revise itself because, for example, they won't fight on the Sabbath day. So they try to hide. And the Greeks just look for them. When they find them, they kill them on the Sabbath because they won't fight because that's working. And so they have to sort of modify things as they go along. They find these mothers who secretly have their sons circumcised, so they kill the children. It's horrible, right? They hang the children from their own intestines on the mother's necks. They have to parade them around the city, and then they cast them from the temple. So, I mean, Seleucus wanted nothing less than the destruction of Jewish culture and the religion of Judaism. Now, after he sets up his image in the temple, he sends his people around from every town and village. And so there's the officials come, they sacrifice a pagan animal, a pig, to Greek god, to Zeus, and then publicly you must consume it. And if you don't, you're killed on the spot. So they come to this small village, seemingly insignificant, named Modin. And there's a family that has Monians. A man, and he has multiple brothers. I can't remember how many. But as it's going on, Mattathias is the father's name. And he's kind of the elder of the village. He won't do it. Not only does he not do it, he takes out a sword he had hidden and he kills the 3 men who have come, the Greek envoys. So they know they're in problems now. So he calls all the people to him. And basically the story is, over the next several years, the Maccabees, they're called the Maccabees, the word means the hammers. This tiny guerrilla army will defeat the greatest army of the ancient world. They do defeat the Greeks. Now, part of the reason for that is Ptolemy had begun his attacks on other areas. And so the Greeks were constantly pulling a lot of their best troops because in the big scheme of things, the Holy Land was not their major holding. But nevertheless, it gave the opportunity for Israel to reclaim itself and its independence. And so they did. They reconquered the temple in Jerusalem. They reconsecrated the temple. That's what Hanukkah celebrates. The statue is destroyed. The altar is reconsecrated to the Lord. And then little by little, they're able to make these gains until by the end of about about 100 years. The end of about 100 years, the Maccabees have succeeded in almost reconquering the entirety of David's old kingdom. Only one part in the middle remains problematic. That's why Galilee, where Jesus ends up being born, is Jewish, but it's cut off from Judea, and in between is Samaria. They were never able to conquer Samaria, so that remained pagan. Now, at that point, having conquered things, the Maccabees make a horrible mistake. Right? They kind of sit back and they go, look what we've done. God's given us victory like he did Joshua over this vastly superior foe. So, we could restart the kingdom of Judah, because here we have the descendants of King David still alive. But why would we do that? They didn't do this, we did. So we're going to make ourselves king of Israel and high priests. And so they take the step, and that's why by the time of Jesus you have all these groups. And all those groups are formed on what they think of the Maccabees, most of whom despise them, except the Sadducees. The Pharisees hate them, the Zealots hate them. So just to put out the final part of the story. So what happens? Well, eventually, the Seleucid Empire, the wars end. And so it has its authority again. It has full attention it can give to this province it lost almost 100 years ago. And so the Seleucids send an enormous army to reconquer the whole of Israel. Well, the Israelites aren't stupid, even though God gave them the victory. And they say, we need some allies. So they look around the Mediterranean. They kind of burned a lot of bridges. Egypt doesn't like them anymore or trust them and all these other places. So hey, there's this tiny little just city that's just starting to become well known for its trading power on the Western Sea. And that's Rome. So they go to Rome and they ask for help. Israel asked for Rome to come. And Rome did. General Pompey, the famous Pompey, he came and he defeated the Greeks. Becomes one of the Romans' huge first victories as well to start their hegemony of their empire. And he decides, this place isn't so bad, I think we'll stay. And so they did. And that's why by the time of Jesus, for over 400 years, Israel has not been ruled, except for this little brief time period, which was one of constant war there, though, has not been ruled by its own people. So, in the Bible, there are people called zealots. The first one is a man named Phineas, who's a descendant of Aaron. I think he's his son. If not, he's his grandson. Then there's Elijah the prophet. And then there's finally the Maccabees. At the time of Jesus and James, these, in the popular conception of Israel, these are sort of the heroes of heroes. And in fact, there's two groups that will entirely base a lot of their understanding on them. The Zealots, one of them was in Jesus' group, right? Simon the Zealot, he had been one of these people. And the Pharisees. Now, what is the characteristic shared by all these groups? Two of them. They're all known for killing unfaithful Jews, or Israelites, and they're known for wiping out Gentiles. Elijah kills the 300 priests of Baal. Phineas kills the Cosby and I forget the man's name, who have sort of repudiated Israel, and the Maccabees are clearly known, killing both their own who they felt were sympathizers with the Greeks, as well as killing lots of Gentiles. And so these people, this is what it means to be zealous. When Paul says he's zealous, he means he's willing to kill for his faith. That's precisely what he did. He killed Christians. Killed them. Whenever he uses the term in his autobiography, like little bits he speaks of 3 times, it's never used in a good sense. Zeal is not a good sense in Paul's Christian understanding. Because zeal has led them to a false view of the kingdom, he once held. But what is the false view? Well, the first part of the false view is, just as God did for Joshua, and just as in more recent times he did for the Maccabees, God is going to do that for us against Rome. Right? We're going to throw out Rome. Then, after Rome is thrown out, then the kingdom will come. And once the kingdom comes, it means that Israel is on top, ruling the world, and we wipe out all those horrible Gentiles who were not our friends. Some of the Passovers, some of the Orthodox Passover meals still have that prayer about the judgment on all the Gentile nations to come as soon as possible. As part of certain groups within Israel's prayer for this. So, at the time of Jesus, you need to realize that violence was always there. It was a non-stop part of the entire lifestyle of people in Palestine. It was what whether you were Jewish, a Jewish Christian, no matter what it was, something was always simmering. Anytime there was the slightest change in power or vacuum left, for instance, when Herod dies, there is an immediate revolt. Herod's death leads immediately within days, to the rebellion of Judas the Galilean, who takes the whole city of Sepphoris the Syrian governor has to send multiple legions to wipe out and destroy the entire city, Jesus would have been about 4. He only lived a few miles from Sepphoris. It's probably what he and Joseph were building as carpenters, because there's no wood in the Holy Land. Probably what they were doing is the rebuilding of Sepphoris, less than 4 miles away. And every man, woman, and child in Sepphoris was killed, as an example. The Zealots were constantly uprising every time they could. And the Pharisees sort of, from the shadows, promoted it. They wouldn't go out of their way to attack the Gentiles. They always played the card of we're kind of in between. But they certainly induced the Zealots to their acts. And the Pharisees were certainly fine with killing unfaithful Jews, right? The martyrdom of Stephen, their role in all those different things, and Paul's own example. So you need to realize when James is talking about peace, and just very briefly, notice he ends the last word of chapter 3 is peace, and he mentions it twice. Is sown in peace for those who cultivate peace. The very next verse, remember there wouldn't be chapters in the original letter, James says, where do the wars and where do the conflicts come from? You kill and envy, you covet, you fight and wage war. He's not simply being dramatic. He's literal, because in his audience are some of these people, or at least sympathizers, many of whom are probably saying, yeah, let's kill those wealthy Christians. They're certainly a blight to what we're trying to be in our faithfulness. Yes, let's wipe out some of these who are hurting us, right? So James is not simply reaffirming Christian belief that we're followers of the Prince of Peace. James has a literal situation on his hands. In fact, he seems to accord that murder's already occurred, he'll tell us in chapter 5. You know, for us, it's unthinkable. We're like, who in the church would go out and start killing people and such? Well, it wasn't unthinkable in the first century in terms of the whole milieu. Jesus was clear, and that's why so much of Jesus' ministry is so focused on opposing this whole idea. Right? He tells them from the beginning, the way God did here was a certain point in time. He's not going to do that now. And if you do that, you'll lose. The temple will be destroyed again. Everything you think you're going to gain will be lost. They don't listen. But that's why the turn the other cheek, be willing to go the extra mile when asked of it. All these things are that in Jesus' mind, this way can't work. God doesn't accept this way as the way that will ultimately bring about the kingdom of God. And he certainly doesn't accept the byproduct that's sprung up in popular conception, not in actual Jewish teaching of any kind, but in the popular sort of mind of what was going to happen. And so the way of peace is the way of Jesus, the Prince of Peace. And it can't be this way of violence and sort of threats and everything else that were so used by the Pharisees and the Zealots to achieve what they wanted. So here on page 10 of the handout, this perfect peace occurs only when the Prince of Peace brings to earth God's justice, truth, and peace. And so the Christian, in the meantime, is called to create and maintain a state of truth, honesty, righteousness, and justice with themselves and with their community, but not to resort in violence. And James has already alluded to it, but now we understand a little more why. For the wrath of man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. Right? Your anger, your violence, your aggression, you're not doing the will of the Lord. You're going to fail in this. Instead, we're peacemakers who will be called children of God. And so what we see again is James is again contrasting two ways. The life of the wicked fool and the life of the righteous wise man. The wise person submits their heart to God and lives by the Torah, and as a result of that obedience, they receive all these blessings of God, ultimately eternal life. The fool, though, knows what is good, but rejects the Lord and seeks to live according to his own ideas or prejudices and opinions. And so by refusing to obey Yahweh, he acts with folly and falls into deeper and deeper sin. So a lot of the choice that's before them is the violence with which is plaguing society and which has worked its way into the church. And James wants to be very clear. The Church of Christ, the Prince of Peace, and the one who brings the shalom of God, it can't have anything to do with the old way, because God doesn't respond in that way anymore. He did for a time, but as Paul says, in the time of Christ, all the things that were allowed before, Paul says in his thing, that's no longer the case. God deals with the human race according to a whole different pattern now. And so you have this struggle even within the community itself. You have the wealthy who are killing the poor by taking their land and then basically starving them to death. These are within the church. You have the zealots who have probably killed a few of the rich Christians in response to what they've done. And so and add that to the fact that you have the outside world, both pagan and Jewish, is kind of coming down on the church because they don't fit perfectly into Judaism, being believers in the Messiah, and they certainly don't fit into the pagan world. And so James's community is under a lot of pressure. That's absolutely true. But he keeps reminding them, the way forward, though, is not the ways you want it, is not going to achieve by the way you're doing it. Through violence and attacking one another and sort of coming down in this way. There has to be this way, the way of peace, the way of purity, sort of this example that James is bringing forth. James himself is called James the Just in tradition because he was known for extreme fidelity. They said he prayed in the temple so much and prayed so often, his knees were like camel things, all leathery. Which is interesting in itself because Jews don't pray anyway. They pray standing. That's why Jesus says, when you stand and pray, he says it a lot of times. And if you see Jews at the Wailing Wall, they all stand. And sometimes they do this motion. Part of that, and they'll even do this, you'll see some of the Orthodox, that's because you may not look at God. And so some Orthodox Jews have their head, and then the head bobbing is just meant to kind of bring forth that experience of the Spirit and that act of the submission is the yarmulke and other signs, not kneeling. It'd be very rare that Jews kneel in the Old or New Testament. Right?
Take the Orthodox Jews that obviously live and breathe the Torah. So if you're immersed in the Word of God from the Old Testament, I know it's fake. How can they not transition into learning and knowing about Jesus? Because obviously they do.
Yeah.
They just can't.
I don't have an answer except to say, some things weren't as obvious as they are to us in hindsight. That's one thing. But also, if a lot of people have this mentality, and the Messiah presented them, not only in the sense that the Messiah, because we always talk about the one aspect, a crucified Messiah. That's true. That would have stumbled some of them, but the fact that he rose from the dead would have been a big selling point too. That, maybe we can overcome the horrible manner in which he died as the Messiah because now he reigns. But then presented, not only is the Messiah the crucified Messiah, but now he's the one who preached peace, who basically said, don't fight the Romans, don't do all these things. You can see how some people are just so caught up in their own way of thinking, their own way of doing things, they can't transition. I think we have a not exactly the same level, but I think there's a good example with Vatican II, right? Some people could not abide the changes, even though none of the changes were truly doctrinal. They were primarily pastoral. But some people had so invested their lives in sort of a particular devotional or liturgical or something way of the church that it couldn't be let go of when they left. And, the church has made accommodation sense in order to bring that about, but some just left. Some because the church wasn't the church anymore. And so I think it's a similar thing to look at what Jesus offered, even with all the promises and everything else. Like a lot of us, they wanted kind of results now. Well, who's going to get the Romans out? Who's going to, even if this Messiah is here, what does that mean? I think there's a lot of different things that are involved, but I think that's part of it, is they can't see the connection as clearly as maybe we can, who aren't intimately involved with it. Even Paul says it wasn't made known to people in earlier ages, so he seems to indicate himself that until Christ kind of touches you, you can still read the Old Testament with blinders on, so to speak. In 2 Corinthians, here's what it's very interesting if I can find it quick. He says, let's see. in 2 Corinthians, I'll just read this part, he says, "Thanks to God who leads us to triumph in Christ and manifests through the odor of knowledge of him in every place. For we are the aroma of Christ for God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing." He says, "Who is qualified for this? For we are not like the many who trade on the words of God, but out of sincerity we speak in Christ." He says, "Are we beginning to commend ourselves, or do we need, as some of you do, letters of recommendation? For you are our letter written on our hearts and read by all, shown to be a letter of Christ administered by us, written not in ink, but by the Spirit of God, not on tablets of stone, but on the hearts that are of flesh. Such confidence we have through Christ toward God, not that we ourselves are qualified to take credit for anything is coming from us, but rather our qualification comes from God, who has indeed qualified us as ministers of his covenant, not of letter but spirit. For the letter brings death, but the Spirit gives life. Now if the ministry of death," now that's how he refers to the Old Testament, the ministry of death. If the ministry of death carved in letters on stone, right, we're talking about Sinai, was so glorious the Israelites could not look intently at the face of Moses, and its glory was going to fade, how much more will the ministry of the Spirit be glorious? For the ministry of condemnation was glorious. Now, there is not a nice thing Paul is saying about the Old Testament. How much more will the ministry of righteousness abound in glory? Indeed, what was endowed with glory before has come to have no glory, because it has been surpassed. He's talking about the Old Testament. He says that way is completely dead. That it had its purpose. So I think when we read stuff like that, you can realize why some Jews have a problem saying, but it was all for show. I mean, that's Paul's ultimate answer. What was the law for? 2 reasons. Punishment. He says, the law started with 10 commands in 1 chapter of worship. But because of the sin of Sinai, we suddenly add 631 laws. So in one sense, historically, Paul's correct. The reason the law is enormous is because of the sin of Sinai. If you read the Bible carefully, the original law consisted of the 10 Commandments and what's called the Book of Worship. And it told how to worship God, very simply. Then after the 10 Commandments, God adds all the other laws of Exodus and the whole books of Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. So he is correct in a sense. Part of it's due to punishment. And the second one, and this one's hard to swallow too, but he says in the great scheme of things, the whole point of the law was for Israel to stand apart, but ultimately to realize it couldn't fulfill the law. It couldn't do what the law wanted it to do, which was to bring forth this holiness. It kept people separate from Israel, from pagans, so therefore the Messiah could still be born from it. But it itself could never achieve holiness. And so something brand new has to occur. And the letter to the Hebrews, another Hebrew author, says a very similar thing. So for a lot of Jews, Christianity just wasn't an option. They still held too strongly to their faith. I mean, a lot of them had died for it, or for all of these people who died, and then to be told, well, it was just a stage. It was just a stage, and you completed it, but it's a stage.
Move on.
Yeah, exactly. So move on. Well.
Chris, does Paul ever soften his harsh words against the Old Testament? Because it seems like Protestants ignore the Old Testament too in favor of just the New.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a broad statement, but I do agree in general that yes, because and we also have to focus which Protestants. Most modern evangelicals don't fully buy the Reformation principle in the sense of justification by faith alone. A lot of them more very modern, like unnamed churches that are just evangelical, they definitely believe the only word of God, the only thing God ever says, and the only thing that's important is the Bible. But some of them have broken away from the idea of the original Reformation churches and what we call the fundamentalists and the earlier evangelicals, who are very much faith alone, and that's the doctrine by which the church stands or falls. So we read everything through the lens of Paul. Now, with that caveat, yeah, Protestantism in general has tended to not be very connected to the Old Testament. They see such an absolute break that goes even beyond what Paul was saying, because Paul will still say the Old Testament does have value, and that it shows us the oracles of God, it shows us the promises of God that God never takes back. It still can be read profitably for how we're supposed to live. It all points to Messiah. So he has a lot of good things. He does have good things to say about it. But for Protestants, it's been a very kind of it hasn't been pushed as much. And in fact, that was the whole Protestant thought at the beginning, is Luther compared the church of his time to the Pharisees, who he spoke of as being Old Testament. Whereas he saw the new movement of Protestants as being like what Jesus' original followers were like in his mind, coming from one very specific idea of St. Paul, not even taking all of St. Paul into account. So, yeah, I think in general that's very true. Just the idea that the canon within the canon of Protestantism has generally read the whole Bible, including Jesus' Gospels, through the lens of Paul is odd for us. Just that is odd in itself. And so there has been a bit of a disconnect. Yeah, that's the thing is, Paul is kind of balanced out. Romans isn't quite as harsh as some of his earlier ones. And we also have to be very careful because James's letter is what we call an encyclical. That's why those letters, the 2 letters of Peter, James, the 3 letters of John and Jude, they're called Catholic letters. They're even called that by Protestants. That was just their title from a long time. But Catholic in the sense of universal. So it's like an encyclical letter, which means to go around the world, to encircle the world. So James is writing almost sort of to the church as a statement. We have to remember that Paul is writing to individual churches for specific reasons and specific issues. And so it becomes very difficult to pinpoint Paul sometimes on what his overall thought is, because he's a pastor, so he's dealing with the problem. For example, Paul never completely answers the question of this. Paul does not want Gentiles in any way to adopt Judaism, because for him it's going backwards. And so he tells people, if you have yourself circumcised as a Gentile after accepting Christ, for the reason of being Israel, he says, you're excommunicated, right? You're out. So he clearly sees that, but he never ever actually answers the question about what about a full-blown Jew who does become a believer like Paul, who's not called to be a minister to the Gentiles? Do they have to give up their faith? And on that, he never actually states the question, because he's not ever faced with that issue or reason, because his churches are Gentile. And at most they have some Jews in them, but they're predominantly Gentile that he forms. So that's the other thing, is we have to be careful, because Paul is a circumstantial writer. And it's very difficult to take circumstance and make it into an overall doctrine. You have to look at everything that Paul says, you have to kind of get an idea. You also have the problem, unlike James isn't writing to anyone expecting a response. Paul is referring to letters he has been written to that we don't have. So that's another problem. We have to kind of guess sometimes what Paul's even referring to, because he doesn't always come out clearly and say it, because he doesn't have to. He wrote at the time, and they knew what they wrote, and he just was giving them an answer. So that's why Paul can be very sort of difficult to read. The church, obviously, as a whole, though, didn't take the Pauline route in the full way. It found a good balance, really, in Peter. I mean, this is just my opinion at this point, but I purposely think that's why Peter, one of the marks that Jesus knew ahead of time in forming him as a leader. Because, look, you have James, who's brilliant. He can write or communicate in Greek. He's well known. He's the first person to run the Jerusalem church. He's literally related to the Messiah by blood, and super conservative. And then you have Paul, who was super conservative, but in a sense becomes super liberal, all for the Gentiles, everything else. And Peter kind of remains as the centerpiece, right? He never goes the full length of James in requiring that everything be still Jewish, but he never buys into the entire argument of Paul that Judaism doesn't have a part in it. And it's really because of him, I would say, predominantly in his vision and influence of why Catholicism looks like it does. Right? You go into our place, it's a synagogue. I mean, we have the bema, the altar, we have a tabernacle, we keep different things in it, but they have a tabernacle. We have all the things. We follow the pattern of the synagogue service. We follow, connected to the Passover meal for the second half, the liturgy of the Eucharist. I mean, our people wear, the priests wear robes that look like Israel, right? I mean, yes, Roman too, but Israel also, especially the weird hats. No one in Rome wore hats like that. That doesn't come from Rome, right? That's the weird turban type stuff that the high priest wore. So we're very, and the whole idea of, we still have that balance between faith and work. Sometimes people make it sound like we're just about works. That's really just overblown exaggeration because we've had to deal with the exaggeration of only faith. So we promoted works, but Catholicism has always kept this kind of balance, And my opinion, like I said, is just my opinion, but I think Peter is a large part to play in that whole reality. Is that he never repudiates his Judaism at all. At the same time, he recognizes something brand new has occurred, and it kind of fits into the pattern. But I mean, even the way we organize ourselves, right? We're Israel. The high priest, the chief priest, the priests, the Levites, the faithful. We have the high priest, the pope, the chief priest, the bishops who choose him from their group, just like the chief priest did in Israel. The priests were the priests. The Levites were ordained, but they could not offer sacrifice or forgive sin. They assisted the priests. The deacons are ordained. They don't offer sacrifice, forgive sin, but they assist the priest. You've got the Nazarites, who are male and female priests or laity, who took special vows. We have religious. Then you have the faithful and the faith. I mean, we're literally patterned hierarchically after Israel. So Catholicism, that's why we understand ourselves as the perfection, the completion in process still, but the completion of the covenant people of God. That it's taken all that's come before and it's moving forward. And in Catholic understanding, it will be perfected in this world when many, many Jews return to the community that really is theirs from the beginning. So Paul says all Israel will be saved. Jesus tells them from the time of the destruction of the temple is the time of the Gentiles. But before the time of the Gentiles end, Israel will return to the Messiah, and then I'll come. You have, especially in the 80s and 90s, you have all those Left Behind books and series and everything else in the Rapture. Just to make it clear, the Rapture is actually a heresy for Catholicism. It's not even an opinion you can hold like as no, the Rapture is a heresy as far as the Catholic Church is concerned. But that being said, because they have a weird way of reading the Bible, certain evangelicals, certainly not Protestants in general, a lot of them read it like us, but they have, like, it's for step by step. And it's so precise, it's almost to the point of weird, right? Russia's going to start a war in this country, and they use all these symbols for really odd things. But it's super detailed. Like, I have a book of one of them that's charts, chart after chart of LaHaye laying it all out, About 15 or 20 years ago, sort of when this stuff was at its height, the church released just a little tiny document. I think it's like 12 pages long, 8.5 by 11. And it's the story and you wouldn't realize it because it's so technical sounding unless you were looking for it. It's the statement on eschatology. Because eschatology means the last thing. And in there, it gives the Catholic teaching on the last days. And it's interesting, the only thing that is required before Christ comes again is the conversion of Israel. And then the church goes forth to say, and we have no idea what that means. Like, we don't know if that means, are we to look for a big mass exodus into the church at a certain time, like all at once? Are we talking about from the beginning of the church's foundation at Pentecost until a certain number of, quote, Jews are reached who enter it? We don't know. We just simply know that until the Messiah, until that comes, that's not going to happen. Let's go ahead and take our break, and then we'll come back and we can ask more questions, and we'll start on chapter 4.
So the conversion of Israel